At Thanksgiving dinner, my older sister laughed and called me a doormat in front of the entire family. She said I was too weak to ever stand up for myself. 2 weeks later, when my dad begged me to seal sign a $400,000 loan, I just smiled and said, "Sorry, doormats don't sign legal documents." 6 months later, her perfect family vacation cabin was forced to be sold, and she was the one calling me crying. If you asked my family to describe me, they would probably pause for a second, look at each other, and then say something polite but vague like, "Ethan's the quiet one, not the successful one, not the interesting one, not even the dependable one, just the quiet one. The background noise in a family that has always been very loud about everything." I'm 31 now, and I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, in a house where conversations were never really conversations. They were competitions. Whoever spoke the loudest or had the most dramatic story automatically won the room. That usually meant my older siblings. My sister Vanessa has always been the family's golden example of success. She's 38, works as a corporate consultant, and somehow manages to present every part of her life like it belongs in a lifestyle magazine. 2 kids, a spotless suburban house, a perfectly planned schedule, and the kind of confidence that makes people assume she's always right about everything. At every family gathering, someone eventually points to Vanessa as proof that the Carter family raised at least one person who really figured things out. Then there's my brother Tyler. Tyler is 35, and somehow the exact opposite of Vanessa, while still getting the same amount of attention. Tyler has spent most of his adult life jumping from one startup idea to another. Every 6 months, there's a new big opportunity he's working on. One time, it was a cryptocurrency consulting service. Another time, it was a subscription box for fitness supplements. At one point, he tried to build an app that connected people with freelance dog walkers who specialize in high-energy breeds. None of it ever worked out. But Tyler has charisma. That's the word everyone uses. He's funny. He tells big stories. He walks into a room like he already owns it. So even when his latest plan falls apart and he ends up sleeping on someone's couch again, the family treats it like he's some kind of lovable risk-taker instead of a guy who can't keep his life together. Then there's me. I learned pretty early that my role in the Carter family was to stay quiet and make things easier for everyone else. When arguments started at the dinner table, I stayed out of them. When someone needed help, I was the first one to volunteer. Not because anyone forced me to, but because it was the simplest way to avoid conflict. Over time, that became my entire identity in the family. While Vanessa built her polished career and Tyler chased his next big idea, I went the boring route. I studied finance, got a stable job as a financial analyst, and slowly built a life that didn't involve chaos. I paid my bills on time. I kept my credit score clean. I lived in a small but comfortable apartment and focused on work. None of that ever made for interesting family conversations. But being the responsible one had its uses, at least for everyone else. When Tyler's credit card debt got so bad that collection agencies started calling him every day, I was the one who spent hours helping him negotiate payment plans and consolidate the balances. When Vanessa needed someone to babysit her kids because a client meeting ran late, I was the one she called. When tax season came around, my parents never bothered going to an accountant. They just handed me a folder full of paperwork and said something like, "Ethan, you're good with numbers. Can you take a look at this?" I never charged them anything. It didn't even occur to me to ask. And then there was the money. Tyler has borrowed money from me more times than I can count. It always started the same way. A long explanation about a temporary setback, followed by a confident promise that he'd pay me back as soon as his latest project started generating income. Most of the time, that money never came back. Vanessa wasn't much different, just more subtle about it. She rarely asked for loans, but she had no problem assuming I would cover things. Family dinners where the bills somehow ended up in front of me. Holiday gifts that were from both of us, even though I paid for them. Little financial favors that slowly added up over the years. The strange part is that none of them ever acted like they were asking for something unusual. In the Carter family, my help wasn't considered generosity. It was just the natural order of things. Ethan handles it. Ethan will figure it out. Ethan doesn't mind. And for a long time, I told myself they were right. Keeping the peace felt easier than pushing back. If Tyler needed help fixing another financial mess, I helped him. If Vanessa needed a last-minute babysitter, I showed up. If my parents handed me a stack of tax forms on a Sunday afternoon, I sat down at the kitchen table and worked through them. No one ever said thank you in any meaningful way. Not because they were trying to be cruel, but because they genuinely didn't see it as something special. To them, I wasn't the generous one. I was just a reliable background character who made everyone else's lives run a little smoother. And for years, I convinced myself that this was what being a good son and a good brother looked like. That staying quiet and agreeable meant I was doing the right thing, that if I just kept helping, eventually someone might notice. But the truth was that in my family, the quieter you were, the easier it was for everyone else to forget you were even there. Thanksgiving at my parent house in Dayton had always followed the same predictable pattern, and that year I drove there already knowing exactly how the day would go. The highway was crowded with holiday traffic, and I remember gripping the steering wheel while mentally running through a checklist of everything I had managed to prepare despite the week I had just survived. I had worked my regular hours as a financial analyst during the day and picked up extra shifts doing freelance financial reports in the evenings because I was trying to accelerate some of my own financial goals. By the time Thursday arrived, I was exhausted, but I still spent part of the morning baking a pecan pie from scratch because my mother always said Thanksgiving didn't feel complete without one. When I walked into my parents' house carrying the pie, the place already smelled like roasted turkey and cinnamon. Vanessa's kids were running through the hallway yelling. Tyler was somewhere in the living room talking loudly about something, and the television was playing a football game no one was actually watching. It was the same chaotic environment it had always been. I stepped into the kitchen and placed the pie carefully on the counter. My mom barely looked up from the stove. Her first words to me weren't hello, or thanks for bringing something. She just said, "Ethan, did you remember the whipped cream?" I told her I had in the bag, and she nodded like I had simply completed an expected task on a checklist. Then she immediately went back to stirring something on the stove while giving Vanessa instructions about where to place the dishes on the table. No one commented on the pie. No one asked how I had been. I hung up my coat, greeted the kids, and took my usual seat at the edge of the living room while everyone else continued talking over each other. Tyler was standing near the couch in the middle of an animated explanation about some new tech app he was supposedly about to launch. He was using his hands constantly while describing how it was going to disrupt the market and scale insanely fast once investors saw the potential. Everyone listened to him like he was pitching the next billion-dollar company. Vanessa chimed in occasionally with supportive comments. My dad nodded along like he understood the business model, and my mom smiled proudly even though Tyler had given this exact type of speech at least a dozen times before. Eventually dinner was ready, and we all gathered around the table. The food looked great, like it always did. My mom took a lot of pride in Thanksgiving dinner, and she put an enormous amount of effort into it every year. The conversation immediately shifted into the usual rhythm. Vanessa started talking about her kids' private school. She described their test scores, their music lessons, the advanced reading programs they were in, and how competitive the admissions process had been. She talked about it with the kind of pride people usually reserve for major life achievements. Everyone at the table reacted exactly the way she expected. My parents kept complimenting the kids. Tyler joked about how smart they were going to be compared to the rest of us. I mostly stayed quiet and focused on my plate. At one point, there was a brief lull in the conversation, and without really thinking much about it, I casually mentioned that I had finally paid off the last of my student loans a week before. It had taken years of consistent payments and careful budgeting to reach that point. It was a milestone I had been working towards since my mid-20s. I said it in a calm voice, not trying to make a big announcement, just sharing something that mattered to me. No one reacted. Vanessa had already started another story about her daughter's piano recital. Tyler interrupted halfway, threw to jump back into describing his app idea again. My dad asked my mom to pass the mashed potatoes. Within seconds of conversation, had completely moved on like I had never spoken at all. I remember sitting there quietly with my fork in my hand, realizing that the moment had disappeared before it even existed. Dinner eventually ended, and everyone moved back into the living room where the atmosphere became more relaxed. People were eating pie. The kids were playing on the floor, and the adults started drifting into those random conversations that always happened during long family gatherings. At some point, Tyler started joking about personality types. He had read something online about how every group of people falls into different roles, and he began assigning them to everyone in the family, like it was some kind of game. Vanessa immediately leaned into it. Tyler pointed at her first and said she was obviously the boss. Everyone laughed and agreed because it fit perfectly with the way she ran every conversation. Then he pointed at himself and declared that he was the visionary, which made my dad laugh because Tyler had always liked seeing himself that way. My dad was labeled the provider, which he accepted proudly, and my mom was called the glue because she was the one who kept everyone connected and organized. The whole thing was lighthearted at first, the kind of harmless teasing families do when they're relaxed. Then Vanessa turned toward me with a smirk on her face. She tilted her head slightly and said, "Ethan." There was a brief pause, like everyone was waiting for the punchline. Then she laughed and said, "Oh, he's the doormat." The room exploded with laughter. Vanessa leaned back into the couch, clearly enjoying the reaction, and continued talking while people were still chuckling. She said, "I was a guy who let everyone walk all over him." She said, "I barely existed in the family unless someone needed help with something." She joked that if our family were a company, I'd basically be the unpaid intern. The worst part wasn't what she said. The worst part was that everyone else kept laughing. Tyler shook his head, like it was the funniest thing he had heard all night. My dad smiled awkwardly but didn't say anything. My mom didn't correct Vanessa or defend me. No one pushed back. I did what I had always done. I forced a small smile and pretended the joke didn't bother me. I nodded along like it was harmless teasing and took another bite of pie while the conversation kept moving. But in that moment, sitting there on the couch while my entire family laughed at the idea that I was basically someone people walked on, something inside me shifted in a way it never had before. For most of my life, I had convinced myself that keeping the peace was a mature thing to do, that being agreeable meant I was the bigger person. But that night, listening to them laugh, I realized they didn't see my patience as kindness. They saw it as weakness. And for the first time in my life, something inside me finally cracked. 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, life had mostly returned to its normal rhythm. I went back to work, focused on my projects, and kept my routine simple and predictable. From the outside, nothing had changed. I still woke up early, still spent long hours analyzing financial reports, and still ended most evenings in my quiet apartment, reviewing numbers or reading something related to the market. But something inside my head had shifted in a way I couldn't ignore. The moment on my parents' couch kept replaying in my mind more often than I expected. Vanessa's voice saying the word doormat, the laughter that followed, the casual way everyone accepted it as an accurate description of who I was. I remember the way my dad had smiled awkwardly without saying anything, the way my mom had simply let the conversation move forward like nothing was wrong. For most of my life, I had trained myself not to dwell on things like that. If someone said something hurtful, I told myself they didn't mean it seriously. If someone took advantage of my help, I told myself that being generous was part of being a good family member. That had always been the story I repeated in my own head. But the more I thought about that moment, the harder it became to convince myself it had been harmless. The word doormat kept echoing in the back of my mind. The call from my father came on a Tuesday evening, while I was sitting at my kitchen table finishing some freelance work. My phone lit up with his name on the screen, and the second I saw it, I already had a strange feeling about why he might be calling. My father was not someone who called just to chat. Most of the time when he reached out, there was a practical reason behind it. I answered anyway. His voice sounded upbeat in that slightly forced way people use when they're trying to introduce a request carefully. After a few seconds of small talk about work and the weather, he cleared his throat and said he needed a quick favor. The phrase quick favor was something I had heard many times before in our family. He began explaining that his logistics company had been going through a difficult stretch. Rising costs, delayed contracts, unexpected expenses. As he talked, I could hear the tension underneath his calm tone. The company had apparently taken on more debt than expected, and the bank had started putting pressure on them to stabilize their finances. Eventually, he got to the real point of the call. They needed a bridge loan to keep operations running, while they secured a larger contract that was supposedly close to being finalized. The amount he mentioned was $420,000. Even before he finished explaining the details, I already understood what he was building toward. He said the bank required someone with strong credit to co-sign the loan agreement, so they could release the funds. Apparently, he had already approached the bank twice and been rejected because his own financial profile was too risky given the company's current situation. There was a short pause on the line. Then he said my name again, this time a little more carefully. He told me that I had always been responsible with money, that the bank would probably approve the loan immediately if my name was on the paperwork. He described it like it was a temporary formality that would only last until the company stabilized. As he spoke, I sat quietly in my chair staring at the spreadsheet open on my laptop. The numbers on the screen blurred together, while my mind drifted back to Thanksgiving. I remembered Vanessa leaning back on the couch with that confident smile on her face. I remembered the sound of everyone laughing. Doormat. For most of my adult life, the version of myself that my family knew would have answered immediately. I would have reassured my father that everything would work out and told him I would come by the bank the next day to sign whatever documents they needed. I would have told myself that helping him was the right thing to do. But that night, I didn't respond right away. There was a long silence between us. My father eventually tried to fill the quiet by repeating that it was just a short-term solution, that the company would recover soon, that everything would be fine once the new contract came through. While he talked, I realized something that felt strangely calm. This was exactly the kind of moment Vanessa had been describing. This was the situation everyone expected me to accept without hesitation. When my father finally stopped talking, he asked what I thought. I took a slow breath and said the words in a steady voice that sounded unfamiliar even to me. I told him I was sorry, but doormats don't sign legal documents. For a few seconds, there was nothing but silence on the line. I could almost picture his expression on the other side, the confusion settling in while he tried to understand what I had just said. My father let out a small laugh, the kind people use when they assume someone is joking. He said something about Thanksgiving, about how everyone had just been teasing around the living room. He insisted that Vanessa hadn't meant anything serious by it. He reminded me that family members help each other when things get difficult. His tone was patient but slightly strained, like he was trying to guide me back toward the answer he expected. But the strange, calm feeling inside me didn't go away. I repeated that I wasn't going to co-sign the loan. This time my voice was even steadier. There was another long pause. He tried again, speaking more slowly now, emphasizing how important this was for the company and how much it would mean for the family. The pressure was subtle but unmistakable. Normally, that kind of pressure would have worked. That night it didn't. I told him I hoped the business worked things out, but my answer wasn't a change. After that, there wasn't much left to say. The conversation ended with an awkward quiet that stretched for several seconds before I finally told him goodnight and ended the call. When the line disconnected, I set the phone down on the table and stared at it for a moment. For the first time in my life, I had said no to my family without softening it or apologizing for it afterward. The apartment around me was completely silent, and for a few seconds, I simply sat there absorbing the unfamiliar weight of what had just happened. The silence after I hung up the phone that night did not last very long. At first, everything seemed normal. I went back to looking at the spreadsheet on my laptop, but I wasn't really reading the numbers anymore. My mind kept replaying the conversation with my father. There was a strange mixture of tension and calm sitting in my chest. I had expected that saying no would feel terrifying, like I had just detonated something that couldn't be undone. Instead, it felt oddly steady, like placing a heavy object down after carrying it for years. About 15 minutes later, my phone buzzed. The message was from Tyler. He didn't bother with small talk or context. The text was short, blunt, and immediately hostile. He wrote that Dad told him about the call, and that he couldn't believe how cold I was being. He said the family was dealing with a real crisis, and I was acting like a stranger instead of a brother. According to Tyler, someone with my financial stability, refusing to help was selfish. The word selfish stood out to me in a strange way. For years, I had helped Tyler fix credit problems he had created himself. I had spent hours reviewing his finances and building payment plans that allowed him to avoid bankruptcy more than once. I had even lent him money that quietly disappeared into whatever project he happened to be chasing at the time. Now I was selfish. I didn't respond to the message. A few minutes later, another notification appeared. This time it was Vanessa. Her text was longer and somehow more controlled, but the tone underneath it was even sharper. She said she had heard about my decision and was disappointed. She wrote that families support each other when things get difficult, and that refusing to help our father during a financial emergency was a betrayal of everything our parents had done for us growing up. The way she phrased it made it sound like I had abandoned someone on the side of the road. She also added that if the company collapsed, it wouldn't just affect our father. It would hurt employees, contracts, and people who depended on the business. According to her, my refusal to sign the loan papers might trigger consequences that extended far beyond our immediate family. I read the message twice before locking my phone. The next day at work, my concentration was almost non-existent. My phone buzzed several more times with smaller messages from both of them. None of them contained any curiosity about why I had refused. None of them asked what my perspective was. Every message simply reinforced the idea that I had failed a family. By the evening, my mother called. Her voice carried the same soft tone she always used when she wanted to guide a conversation in a specific direction. She started by asking how I was doing and whether work had been stressful lately. The small talk lasted less than a minute before the real subject appeared. She said my father had been extremely worried since our conversation. According to her, the business situation was more fragile than he had admitted. If they couldn't secure financing soon, the company might collapse entirely. She spoke slowly, emphasizing the emotional side of the situation rather than the financial one. She reminded me how many years my father had spent building that business from nothing. She said losing it now would devastate him. Her words carried a quiet layer of guilt underneath them. While she talked, I asked a simple question that I had not thought to ask during the original phone call. I asked whether anyone else in the family had invested in the company. There was a brief pause on the line before she answered. She said that years ago, when the business had been expanding, Tyler and Vanessa had both contributed money as small investors to help fund new equipment and operations. It had apparently been presented as an opportunity back then. The company was growing, profits looked promising, and everyone expected the investment to generate strong returns over time. I sat back in my chair when I heard that. No one had ever mentioned that opportunity to me. No one had invited me to participate. During the years when the company was thriving and looked like a profitable investment, my name had never entered the conversation. But now that the company was drowning in debt, I had suddenly become the person they needed to rescue it. I didn't say that out loud to my mother. I simply listened while she continued explaining how serious the situation was becoming. Toward the end of the conversation, she mentioned something else that made the entire situation feel even heavier. She said that if the bank approved the bridge loan, my father planned to secure it using collateral to increase the chances of approval. The collateral he intended to use was the family lake cabin. The moment she said those words, a very specific image appeared in my mind. The cabin sat beside a quiet stretch of water, surrounded by tall trees. My grandfather had built it decades ago with his own hands, and it had been part of our family history for as long as I could remember. Every summer during my childhood, we spent at least a week there fishing, swimming, and sitting around a fire at night. Before my grandfather passed away, he had always talked about how the cabin would belong equally to his 3 grandchildren someday. Vanessa confirmed that detail later that evening, when she sent another message, explaining the plan more bluntly than my mother had. According to her, our father technically still held the legal deed because the property transfer had never been finalized after our grandfather's death. On paper, the cabin still belonged entirely to him. Even though everyone in the family understood that it was meant to be shared between the 3 of us eventually, that legal detail meant he could use it as collateral for the loan. If the business failed after taking the loan, the bank could take the property. The cabin that had been promised to all 3 of us would disappear with the stroke of a pen. When I finished reading Vanessa's message, I placed the phone on the table and stared at the wall across the room. For years, I had quietly helped my family whenever they asked, believing that loyalty and patience would keep things stable. Now, I was watching the same family pressure me to risk everything while they prepared to gamble away something that had never belonged to just one of them in the first place. After the conversation with my mother and the messages from Vanessa, I could not stop thinking about the cabin. That place had always felt different from everything else in our family life. The house in Dayton was just where we lived, but the cabin was where our grandfather had created something lasting. Every board in the walls had a story. Every den in the dock had come from years of use, and every summer memory I had as a kid seemed to lead back to that lake. The idea that it could disappear because of a desperate loan made my stomach tighten in a way I could not ignore. For most of my life, I avoided conflict with my family by staying quiet, but the situation had crossed into something that felt bigger than a family argument. It involved property, legal ownership, and decisions that could permanently erase something that had been promised to 3 people, not just controlled by one. A few days later, I called a property attorney in Cincinnati. I chose someone outside Dayton deliberately because I did not want even a small chance of the conversation circling back to mutual acquaintances. The lawyer's office was located in a tall brick building near the river, and when I walked into the waiting room, everything felt calm and professional in a way that made the chaos of my family situation feel strangely distant. When I explained the situation, I kept my voice steady and tried to stick to the facts. I told him about the cabin, about my grandfather's intentions, and about the deed still technically being in my father's name. I also mentioned that the property was about to be used as collateral for a large loan connected to my father's struggling business. The attorney listened carefully without interrupting. When I finished, he asked a series of very precise questions about the will, the estate process after my grandfather died, and whether any assets had been formally transferred to grandchildren. That was when the conversation started shifting in a direction I had not expected. According to the records he was able to pull up and the documents I later provided, the cabin was not the only asset that had been meant for us. My grandfather's estate had included several financial accounts and physical assets that were supposed to be divided among the grandchildren once everything was finalized. But the distribution had never actually been completed. On paper, multiple assets were still sitting under my father's control, even though they had been intended for the next generation years earlier. The estate process had apparently stalled in a quiet, bureaucratic way that allowed the situation to remain unresolved. The more we reviewed the documents, the stranger the picture became. One of the accounts my grandfather had created was a college fund meant to support the education of future family members. It had been structured in a way that allowed the money to grow over time until the grandchildren needed it. When the attorney showed me the transaction history connected to that account, the numbers told a story I had never heard before. Over the past several years, large withdrawals had been made from that fund. Most of the money had gone toward private school tuition for Vanessa's children. By the time we calculated the totals, nearly 85% of the entire fund had already been used. I sat there staring at the numbers while the attorney explained that the withdrawals had been authorized by the account's managing party, which at the time had been my father. No one had ever mentioned that account to me. No one had asked if I agreed with how the money was being used. It had simply been happening quietly in the background. The pattern continued with other assets. My grandfather had owned an old Jeep that he loved almost as much as the cabin itself. It was one of those vehicles that seemed permanently connected to the lake. I remembered riding in it as a kid while he drove down the narrow dirt roads near the water. According to the records, the Jeep had also remained under my father's authority after the estate process stalled. Tyler had been driving it for years. Again, there had been no conversation about it, no discussion about how it should be shared or transferred. It had simply become part of Tyler's life, while I had been completely unaware of the details. The deeper we looked into the documents, the clearer the pattern became. Important pieces of my grandfather's estate had quietly flowed toward Vanessa and Tyler, while I remained on the outside of those decisions. I kept telling myself that maybe there was an explanation I had not heard yet. Maybe things had been handled in a way that made sense within the family, and I had simply missed the conversations. Then the attorney opened another financial record connected to my name. It was a mutual fund account that had been created years earlier when my grandfather was still alive. I remember the account vaguely, because he had once told me that it would be a small financial foundation for the future, something that would grow quietly over time and help provide stability later in life. The transaction history showed something I had never seen before. 3 years earlier, $62,000 had been withdrawn from the account. The money had not been transferred into another investment in my name. It had not been used for taxes or maintenance fees. It had been moved directly into a business account belonging to my father's logistics company. I felt my chest tighten while I stared at the screen. There was no record of my authorization, no digital signature, no conversation documented in the account notes. Just a clean transaction transferring the funds into a company that I now knew was drowning in debt. I tried to remember if there had ever been a discussion about using that money, but nothing came to mind. No phone call, no family meeting, no moment where someone asked for my permission. The transfer had simply happened. While the attorney explained the legal implications in calm, professional language, the reality settled into my mind piece by piece. For years, I had believed that my role in the family was a quiet helper who kept things running smoothly. But sitting in that office, looking at the transaction history and the estate records, a much harsher truth began to take shape. My family had not only expected my help whenever they needed it, they had already been taking from me long before I realized it. Not through requests, not through conversations, through decisions made quietly behind my back. And the more I looked at the documents in front of me, the harder it became to deny the conclusion forming in my mind. This was not just a story about being taken for granted. This was a story about being used. And somewhere along the way, the line between using someone and stealing from them had already been crossed. After leaving the attorney's office in Cincinnati, I drove back to Columbus in near silence, the highway stretching ahead of me while my mind slowly processed everything I had just learned. For most of my life, I had handled family conflict by minimizing it, telling myself that misunderstandings were easier to ignore than to confront. But the documents I had seen were not misunderstandings. They were records, numbers, transfers, legal ownership structures that had quietly been manipulated for years while I stayed in the background, assuming everyone was acting in good faith. What surprised me most was that I did not feel explosive anger the way people usually imagine in situations like that. Instead, I felt something much colder and more focused. The same mindset I use at work when analyzing financial risks or preparing a strategy for a complicated account slowly took over. My family had spent years assuming that my quiet personality meant I lacked the will to push back. They mistook patience for weakness and silence for blindness. But my silence had never meant I did not understand numbers. If there was one thing my career had taught me, it was that leverage mattered more than arguments. Emotional confrontations rarely solved anything in financial disputes. Evidence, documentation, and timing were what actually changed outcomes. So instead of calling my parents or sending angry messages to my siblings, I started building a plan. The first step involved the cabin. The attorney had explained that even though the deed remained under my father's name, the estate documents and written statements from my grandfather established a clear expectation that the property was meant for the grandchildren. Because the estate had never been finalized properly, there were legal pathways that allowed a beneficiary to request a court review and force a resolution of the ownership structure. In simple terms, I could file a petition requesting the sale or division of the property, so the inheritance could finally be distributed the way it should have been years ago. A week later, the paperwork was submitted. I did not announce it to anyone. There was no dramatic phone call or warning message. The legal system would notify them soon enough. The second step involved the education fund. The attorney had explained that accounts like that were heavily monitored by the institutions managing them, especially when they were tied to family trusts or multi-beneficiary arrangements. If irregular withdrawal patterns were reported, the bank was legally required to review the transactions and confirm that they aligned with the original structure of the fund. Vanessa had withdrawn the majority of the money over several years, and while some of the uses might have technically fallen into educational categories, the scale of the withdrawals raised serious questions about whether the account had been managed fairly for all beneficiaries. I submitted the documentation the attorney helped me prepare and formally requested an audit of the account's activity. Again, I did not tell Vanessa. The bank would contact the account manager themselves once the review process began. The third step took the longest. For years, I had helped different members of my family with financial problems, and because of my profession, I had a habit of keeping records. Emails confirming loan transfers, text messages discussing repayment plans, copies of wire receipts, spreadsheets where I had once tracked balances that were supposed to be temporary. At the time, those records had simply been a practical way to stay organized. Now they became something else. I spent evenings sitting at my desk, reviewing years of digital history. Every unpaid loan Tyler had promised to return. Every financial favor that had quietly turned into a permanent loss. Every email where someone casually assumed I would solve a problem for them, without asking what it might cost me. I organized everything into clear folders and timelines. The process took weeks. Strangely, the more time I spent doing it, the calmer I felt. Each document was another piece of clarity. Instead of vague memories about being taken advantage of, I now had precise records showing exactly how often it happened and how much it had cost. While all of this was unfolding quietly in the background, another change was happening in my life that had nothing to do with my family. For years, I had worked as a financial analyst for other companies, helping them manage budgets, forecasts, and financial planning strategies. It was stable work, but always felt like I was building something for organizations that barely knew my name. Around the same time the legal process began, I started thinking seriously about something I had considered many times before, but never pursued. Starting my own firm. Columbus had a growing community of freelancers, small business owners, and independent contractors who struggled to manage their finances properly. Many of them did not need large corporate accounting firms. They needed someone who could explain financial systems clearly, help them organize their taxes, and build sustainable strategies for growth. I spent several weeks developing the structure for a small independent accounting and financial advisory practice. The process felt strangely energizing. I built a simple website, registered the business legally, and started offering services focused on freelancers, small startups, and independent professionals who had outgrown basic tax software but could not afford large consulting firms. At first, I expected it to grow slowly. Instead, the response came faster than I anticipated. My first few clients came through professional contacts who already trusted my work. Then referrals started spreading through local freelancer communities and small business networks. Within a few months, I had more than 20 regular clients who relied on me for financial organization, tax planning, and long-term budgeting strategies. For the first time in my adult life, the work I was doing belonged entirely to me. The quiet evenings I used to spend fixing other people's financial mistakes in my family were now spent building something stable for myself and the people who trusted my expertise professionally. There was a subtle shift happening inside me that I had never experienced before. For years, I had measured my value based on how useful I could be to my family. Now, without even realizing it at first, I had started building a life that did not depend on their approval at all. Once the legal processes started moving, Things unfolded faster than I expected. Courts and banks do not operate on emotion, and once documents are submitted, they follow procedures that cannot be slowed down by family conversations or uncomfortable phone calls. What had been quiet paperwork on my end slowly began triggering real consequences for everyone involved. The first major shift happened with the cabin. When the legal petition was filed requesting a formal resolution of the inheritance, the property immediately entered a dispute status. That meant the ownership was no longer considered stable enough to support major financial decisions. In practical terms, it meant the cabin could not be used as collateral while the court reviewed the claim. My father learned that the hard way. Apparently, he had already begun the process of presenting the property to the bank as part of the collateral package for the bridge loan. But once the bank's legal department saw the pending petition connected to the estate dispute, the entire asset was flagged as legally uncertain. Banks do not like uncertainty. From their perspective, collateral only works if ownership is completely clear and uncontested. The moment a property becomes part of a legal conflict, it stops being reliable security. Without the cabin, the financial structure my father had been trying to build for the loan collapsed almost immediately. The bank declined the final request. The company never received the money it needed to stabilize operations. For a few weeks, things apparently continued the way struggling businesses sometimes do when they are running on the last fumes of liquidity. Payments were delayed, suppliers grew impatient, and employees started hearing rumors about contracts falling through. Then the inevitable happened. My father's logistics company entered receivership. I did not witness the process directly, but the details eventually became public through court filings and local business records. The receivers took control of the company's remaining assets and began liquidating everything that still had market value. Trucks were sold. Warehouse equipment was auctioned. Office furniture, forklifts, storage systems, and even the company computers were listed and sold off piece by piece. Years of business operations were dismantled within a matter of weeks. Not long after that, the financial pressure reached the family home. The house in Dayton that my parents had lived in for decades was tied into several financial obligations connected to the business. Once the company collapsed and the debt structure started unraveling, the property was pulled into the same financial gravity. Eventually it was sold. The entire sequence unfolded quietly from my perspective because I had stopped answering most of the calls coming from my family. At first, the attempts were aggressive. Tyler left several messages accusing me of destroying the business by interfering with the loan. Vanessa sent long texts describing how much stress the situation was putting on everyone. But as time passed, the tone of those messages started shifting. Around the same time the education fund audit began. The bank managing that account took the request seriously, especially after reviewing the transaction history that showed such a large percentage of the money had been withdrawn by a single beneficiary's household. Audits like that involved documentation requests, explanations for past withdrawals, and a full review of whether the account had been managed according to its intended structure. Vanessa panicked. That became obvious from the messages she began sending. Her earlier anger was replaced by nervous attempts to reconnect. She wrote that the situation had gotten out of control and that the family needed to talk calmly about everything. She insisted that no one had intended to treat me unfairly and that misunderstandings had grown bigger than they needed to be. Tyler followed a similar pattern. His earlier accusations disappeared, replaced by strangely friendly messages asking how I had been doing lately. He mentioned grabbing coffee sometime, said he had been thinking about reconnecting more as brothers, and talked about how important family relationships were. The sudden change in tone was so obvious that it almost felt surreal. For most of my life, I had been the quiet helper who people contacted when they needed something solved. Now the same people were trying to reestablish contact after realizing the situation had shifted in ways they could not control. I did not respond to any of it, not out of revenge and not out of anger, simply because I had finally stopped feeling responsible for fixing their problems. While the legal processes continued unfolding, I stayed focused on my work and the small firm I had built in Columbus. My days were filled with meetings with clients, reviewing financial plans for freelancers, and helping small businesses create systems that prevented the kind of chaos I had spent years quietly cleaning up inside my own family. Eventually, the court reached a decision regarding the cabin. Because the estate had remained unresolved for so long and multiple beneficiaries were now in conflict over how the property should be handled, the judge determined that the most practical solution was a forced sale. The proceeds would then be divided according to the inheritance structure originally outlined in my grandfather's estate documents. The ruling meant the cabin would go on the market. When I read the final notice confirming the court order, I sat quietly in my office for several minutes, remembering the summers the first had spent there as a kid. The sound of the water against the dock, the smell of the trees in the morning, the long evenings when my grandfather would sit on the porch and talk about how important it was for the family to always have a place like that. That place was now being prepared for sale because the people who inherited it had never been able to treat it as something shared. The listing went public not long after the order was finalized. And just like that, the last physical piece of what had once felt like the Carter family's center of gravity was placed into the hands of the open market. The cabin sold in the fall. By the time the listing went live, I had already prepared myself for the reality that it would no longer belong to our family. The court process had been slow but steady, and by the time the sale was finalized, the emotional attachment I once felt had gradually transformed into something quieter. I still remembered every detail of that place, but I no longer felt responsible for preserving it for people who had treated it like a bargaining chip. The buyers were a retired couple from Michigan who had been searching for a quiet property near the lake for years. I saw the listing photos and later read the purchase summary in the court documents. They planned to restore the structure, repair the dock, and slowly renovate the interior while keeping most of the original design intact. For some reason, that detail brought me a small sense of relief. The cabin had been built by my grandfather's hands decades earlier, and knowing that someone intended to take care of it rather than demolish it or convert it into some flashy vacation rental made the ending feel less like a loss and more like a quiet transition. Once the sale closed, the proceeds were divided according to the court order. My share came out to just under $190,000. When the transfer finally appeared in my account, I sat in my office staring at the number for a long time. The money represented more than just property value. It represented years of family tension, broken expectations, and legal battles that had slowly forced the truth into the open. But I did not feel victorious. If anything, the feeling was closer to closure. For several weeks, I left the money untouched while I thought carefully about what I wanted to do with it. The easiest option would have been to simply invest it into my business or add it to my long-term savings. But something about that approach felt incomplete. The cabin had originally belonged to my grandfather, and despite everything that had happened afterward, the memories I had of him remained untouched by the conflict that followed his death. He had always believed deeply in education and in the idea that understanding money meant understanding how the world actually worked. Eventually, I made a decision that felt right. I used a portion of the funds to create a small scholarship program in his name for students studying finance and financial management. The program was not enormous, but it was enough to support several students each year who want to pursue careers in financial planning, accounting, or economic analysis. I worked with a local foundation to structure it properly so it could continue operating long after the initial funding was distributed. The first time I saw the scholarship announcement published with my grandfather's name attached to it, I felt something settle inside me in a way that had nothing to do with money. It felt like restoring a piece of his legacy that had been overshadowed by everything that happened afterward. Meanwhile, my accounting firm continued growing faster than I ever expected. What started as a small operation helping freelancers organize their taxes gradually turned into a full-service financial advisory practice for independent workers, creative professionals, and small business owners who had never been properly supported by traditional accounting firms. Within a year, I hired my first employee, then another. Eventually, I moved the company into a larger office space in Columbus that allowed us to expand our services and take on more clients. We built systems designed specifically for people who worked outside traditional corporate structures, helping them manage cash flow, taxes, retirement planning, and long-term financial stability. Word spread quickly through professional communities that had always struggled to find accountants who understood their reality. The business kept growing. For the first time in my life, the effort I put into something was building a future that belonged entirely to me. One afternoon, nearly a year after the cabin sale, a letter arrived at the office with my father's handwriting on the envelope. I recognized it immediately even before opening it. Inside was a single page. The message was short, but filled with bitterness. He wrote that the collapse of the company had destroyed everything he had spent decades building. He said the legal action surrounding the cabin had made it impossible to secure the financing he needed, and that my decisions had betrayed the family during a time when loyalty should have mattered most. He described what happened as if I had chosen to attack them. There was no acknowledgement of the missing inheritance assets, the mutual fund transfer, or the years of quiet financial pressure that had led to everything unraveling. I read the letter once. When I finished, I folded the paper slowly and sat there for a moment looking at the handwriting across the page. Then I stood up, walked over to the small shredder near my desk, and fed the letter into it. The machine hummed for a few seconds, turning the paper into thin strips that dropped quietly into the container below. I did not feel angry while doing it. I did not feel satisfied either. Mostly I felt calm. For a long time I had believed that standing up for myself meant confronting my family directly and demanding that they treat me differently. But the past few years had shown me something much simpler. Respect cannot be forced out of people who refuse to see your value. It can only be claimed by the person who decides they deserve it. I never set out to destroy anything my family had built. Revenge had never been the goal. All I had ever wanted was to be treated like someone who mattered, and when the people around me refused to offer that respect, I eventually realized something important. I was allowed to give it to myself.